Ya Limadat, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Zainal Mamdani, and I will be your narrator and moderator for this evening's webinar, Let's Talk About Abuse, A Path to Safety. I am currently a member with the Aga Khan Social Welfare Board for Canada, focusing on community partnerships, and by profession, a community leader and advocate. I would like to acknowledge the lands and people of Turtle Island. We are thankful to be welcomed on these lands in friendship. We acknowledge these lands remain home to a number of Indigenous nations and people. Violence within family units between loved ones is reaching epidemic proportions. Family violence touches many of us. When kept behind closed doors, it is shielded and hidden, and it only intensifies. It is protected by silence, everyone's silence. Each of us must examine and change the ways in which our own behavior might contribute to, enable, ignore, or excuse violence. Today's webinar, Let's Talk About Abuse, The Path to Safety, not only explores different types of abuse and the impact regular violence has on a person's mental, physical, and spiritual health, but also provides suggestions for hope and a path to safety. Let's tackle this sensitive topic and destigmatize discussing family violence. Let's reach out and speak out. There is a safe and very hopeful way to end family violence. Now it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you today's exceptional panelists. Zainab Ibrahim from an-Nisa Homes, Mumtaz Walji, National Member for the Aga Khan Social Welfare Board for Canada, and Al-Waez Jamil Sawani, Member of the National Conciliation and Arbitration Board for Canada. You will hear more about each panelist throughout the webinar. Now let's get started. As we learn about family violence and its impacts, we would like to share with you the story of Farah and her family. In the eyes of the community, Farah, age 55, was the picture of success, attractive, living in a lovely home with a gregarious husband. But behind closed doors, Farah's life was misery. Her partner was controlling of her activities and her finances. The constant verbal attacks felt worse than the hits. She always felt like she was walking on eggshells around him. Nothing she did seemed to be good enough. Somehow, he always made her feel that she was the source of their problems. The first time there was abuse, Farah said, I made an excuse. Like, okay, I made him mad. You learn to defend yourself. You learn what you're not supposed to do. But Farah says the abuse progressed and got more violent the longer they were together. And as time passed, she found herself asking, how did I get here? How did I let my kids get here? When she was younger, she had thought of leaving, but was uncertain about how that would be for the children. Now that her son and daughter are adults, they are mirroring what they had been exposed to. Their angry put-downs and verbal attacks make her feel hurt and humiliated. I now introduce to you Mumtaz Walji. Mumtaz comes with over 20 years of experience in the child welfare sector in Ontario and has held a number of positions both in frontline and management at the largest child welfare agency in the country and at the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. Mumtaz is a social worker and is currently the alternative care supervisor with an Indigenous child well-being agency. In her role, She supervises staff that support, assess, and manage foster care, kinship, customary care, and adoption caregivers. She has also held many positions in SEVA, such as she has been the chairperson of the Aga Khan Social Welfare Board for Ontario, principal of the Durham BUI Center, and Durham Seed Coordinator. She is currently a member of the National Social Welfare Board for Canada. Mumtaz?
Thank you so much, Zainal, for that introduction. And thank you for sharing Farah's story with us today. I'd really like to acknowledge that for many of you today, that this is going to be a difficult topic to discuss. We never really want to think about anyone close to us being harmed in any way, but it's important that we understand as a community how we can best support the members of our Jamaat who may be in a relationship that involves violence. So in order for us to support those people, those Murids of our Jamaat, we need to learn and we need to understand about what family violence is. And so this will be my focus as part of today's session. As you can see from the statistics that are currently on the page, nobody is immune to family violence. It can occur in any family. It can occur between intimate partners, between an adult and a child, or even towards an elder. Family violence really impacts us all, regardless of age, race, religion, culture, financial status, education, gender, and even sexual orientation. So let's take a look at these stats. Our stats on the page show us that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men report experiences of violence and abuse. And more than 1/3 of family violence victims were victimized by a current spouse. So I want to pause there for a second. I want to note that partner violence can occur in any type of intimate relationship. So not just in a spousal relationship. It can be couples who are married, engaged, dating, or even in a casual relationship. So this is really an important thing to note. However, this stat speaks to those that are in those marital relationships. The next stat shows us that those between 25 and 34 years of age are 3 times more likely to experience physical and sexual abuse than those aged 45 years and older. And so this is where it becomes really important for us to think about the fact that anybody who's in a relationship in that age category may not necessarily be in a married spousal relationship, but they are still at risk of potential violence and abuse. Children under 18 years are most likely to experience sexual and physical violence and abuse. So child abuse is the mistreatment of a child under 18 by an adult. And this adult can be anybody in the child's life. It is not just limited to parents who may be harming their children. It could also be aunts, uncles, other caregivers, teachers, coaches, really anybody who's an adult that is in some sort of a caregiving role or a role of authority that is causing harm to these children. And then there is elder abuse. So elders 65 years and older are most often victims of violence and abuse by their family members. So elder abuse, when we're talking about elder abuse, is really any action or lack of appropriate action which results in harm or distress to an older person by someone in a relationship of trust. So what does that mean? That means that, it could be that when we talk about appropriate action, it could be that maybe we're not meeting the basic needs of that elder. And that could be such as getting them appropriate medical treatment. If we're looking at elder abuse that's active in action, it could be physical abuse towards that elder. This is a really important thing for us to think about when we're thinking about our elderly Jamaati members and making sure that they're safe and that they're being well taken care of by their family members. If we go to the next slide, we can start to talk about the different forms of violence and abuse. So in Farah's story that we've heard so far with Zainal, there was this emotional abuse that's taking place, the yelling and the screaming, that Zainul talked about in the beginning of Farah's story. And you're going to hear more about Farah's story as we move through the presentation today. But emotional abuse is really about the harmful words, the yelling, the screaming, insults, being condescending, threatening somebody. It encompasses all of those pieces. So that is what emotional abuse looks like. Physical abuse is the one that's most commonly understood, because that is the act of hitting somebody, leaving a mark, harming them with a weapon. And so those are all those forms of physical abuse. And it's important to note that physical abuse, it could be one time, but it can also increase over time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in our next slide. Sexual abuse. So sexual abuse is engaging in that unwanted or non-consented sexual acts with another person. Economic abuse, also known as financial abuse, is when another person is controlling or limiting or restricting or preventing another person access to their own money. And this kind of economic abuse, we'll learn a little bit more that when we get into the cycle of abuse, is sometimes what really holds people back from leaving, because they don't feel like they have the financial capacity to be able to move and leave the situation that they're in. We're going to hear more about spiritual abuse and the spiritual impacts a little bit later from Al-Waez Jamil Sawani. But spiritual abuse is really preventing another person from engaging in their desired religious and spiritual practices, or focusing on religious and spiritual practice, or forcing, sorry, not focusing, but forcing religious and spiritual practices on another person. And then there's intellectual abuse, which is a little bit newer in terms of the thought around abuse, but it's the denial of access to educational opportunities, or restricting the types of educational opportunities that one can engage in. And, this becomes really important in terms of allowing someone to move forward, allowing someone to create a space where they might be able to leave and be independent in their own right, so that they can leave an abusive situation. And then there is property violence. So that's the intentional destruction of another person's belongings. So when you're angry or upset and you've taken somebody else's property and thrown it against a wall and smashed it, or, destroyed somebody's phone because you don't want them to use it to be able to contact help and support, those would be all kinds of property abuse. And it's important to note that it's never one type or form of violence or abuse that happens when there's a family violence situation that is occurring. It is all these different types that might mix together. So there could be often physical abuse, but in combination with emotional abuse and economic abuse that all come together. So there's these different forms come together to form that family violence interaction that might be happening between the different parties. So if we go to the next slide, it's important that we understand what is the root behind family violence. We've talked a little bit about the different kinds of violence, but we need to really get to this point of understanding, where does this come from for individuals who might be abusive in the relationships that they're in. So it's really rooted in obtaining power and control while restricting the power and control of another person. And it's often in relation to a person's self-esteem, self-worth, and their self-concept. So what does that mean? That really means that the person who may be the abuser in a situation has a low sense of self-esteem, has a low sense of their own self-worth. And so they often feel a lack of control in their own life. And so in order to feel control, they need to exert power and control over another person. And this is really a learned behavior over time, in terms of that person who may be the abuser may have suffered their own form of some type of abuse in their life growing up by another person who was caring for them. And so they've learned this behavior. They've learned that they need to exert this power and control over other people in order to feel strong, in order to feel confident in some way. Now, when violence occurs, it can occur on a single occasion or it can occur on multiple occasions. And often what we see in particular with child abuse, intimate partner violence, and in elder abuse situations, in those situations, it's multiple occasions where abuse happens, but it builds over time. And so it might be a smaller event that might happen, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the risks get higher and higher and higher for that person who is in fact being abused in those situations. So often family violence is predominantly hidden behind closed doors, and this is a real concern, and this is a real worry for us. It's so important that if we know a person who may be experiencing any type of abuse, that was listed on the previous slide, that we reach out to them, that we check in on them, and that if it's possible, that we connect them to get help and support. I also want to, talk to those of you that maybe are currently on this webinar, listening to this webinar tonight, that may be experiencing one of these forms of abuse yourself. And I want all of you to know that there is help and support available and that you are not alone. And it's important to reach out and get that support and help if you are experiencing any of these forms of abuse. Abuse situations really create isolation for the person that's being abused. And it's important that we break that isolation and we get connected, and that as a community, we really start to talk about family violence, understanding it, and get rid of the stigma around family violence and open the doors instead of hiding behind the closed doors. So if we move to the next slide, if you can click again for me, then what will happen is we get this picture of the cycle of abuse. Now, often as a social worker, I'm asked why people just don't leave or walk away or call the police if they're being abused. We really need to remember that often abuse occurs with people we have long-standing relationships with. It's not an easy place to be in. And even though the person is harming you or harming someone else, that person has feelings and love for that person. These emotions are often taken into account when considering whether or not someone is going to leave. The person in the relationship also is often dependent on the person who is abusing them. And so again, that makes it difficult for somebody to make that decision to leave a relationship. Often that dependency is financial in nature, and the victim who's being abused worries about how they might take care of themselves if they leave. And often there are, periods of time where the abuse might not be as bad and things stop because the abuser feels sorry for what they're doing. So when you look at this cycle of abuse, we often get into that state where there's tension that starts to build in a situation. And then as the tension starts to build, the stress starts to rise, then that's when an incident happens. So there'll be an incident of violence that takes place. After that incident of violence happens, there is a period of reconciliation because the abuser will feel sorry. They'll be sad. They'll say, I never meant to do it. I'm sorry that I did this. They'll often offer, gifts to the person who has been abused. And so there's this period of reconciliation. And in that period of reconciliation is where often the victim will be like, okay, this person said they're never going to do this again, so I should stay and I should continue to be in this relationship. And so then there's that period where you see number 4 of period of calm. And that period of calm can last a day, a couple of weeks, sometimes even a couple of months before the tensions start building again. It's often where the tension is building and the incident happens where people make the decision to leave. And it's in that time where if you see somebody who is struggling, that's the best time to connect with them, to get them that help and support, to be able to leave that situation or leave that scenario that they're currently in. Because that's when the tensions are high, the incidents have happened, and that fear, that worry for safety comes into play. And so that's the best time to be able to connect with somebody. But again, this cycle happens multiple times. And even sometimes a victim will leave their situation and then they'll go back. And they go back often because of those dependencies that I talked about earlier, and the worries about being alone. And how am I going to be able to take care of my children? Or how am I going to be able to find work to be able to support all the things that I need in order to be able to live? And so these are all the things, the worries that go through the mind of a victim when we're going through this cycle of abuse. So it's not easy to leave. And it's important for all of us to make sure that we are not judgmental in those situations, but that we provide the best support that we can to that Marid of our Jamaat, to that brother, to that sister of ours in the community, and listen and hear and be available when they are ready to maybe leave, or when they are ready to get some support services in place. So with that, I'd like to pass it back to Zainal, who's going to share a little bit more about Farah's story.
Farah picked up the phone to call a crisis line several times, but put it down. One time, she did call, only to hang up quickly when she heard a voice. But one night, her husband had been so cruel in his comments that she felt a desperate need to talk, and she called. The counselor treated her with respect and affirmed that this was verbal abuse, and it was very damaging to self-esteem. The counselor explained the potential danger she was in. Farah didn't feel ready to leave, but she learned that she could call the crisis line anytime she needed to. One night, her husband became upset because they were late making it to Jamaat Khana. It had taken her longer to get dressed to hide the bruise on her cheek. He didn't like being late for Khana. He became verbally aggressive. She told him to stop and that she'd had enough. He attacked her in a rage, shouting and striking her hard. I now introduce to you Al-Waez Jamil Sawani. Al-Waez Sawani lives in Edmonton, Alberta, where he is practicing criminal and civil litigation as a lawyer. He is also a qualified mediator and is currently serving as a member of the National Conciliation and Arbitration Board for Canada. Al-Waez Jamil has a particular interest in the history and evolution of our faith traditions and practices. Welcome, Al-Waez.
Assalamu alaikum and Yamda to all of you. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be able to speak to all of you today about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and talk a little bit about this, the religious imperative of our faith, of our deen, with respect to allowing us to have the audacity to embark on that path towards safety and freedom. And in order to speak about this, I'd like to speak first about a story that most of us are probably familiar with. If we go to the next slide. We're probably all familiar with the story of the hijrah of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his community from moving from Mecca to Medina. Now, let's look at the reason for this particular migration. The Muslims in Mecca lived in constant fear. They felt under attack. They had to tiptoe around, essentially. And many of their oppressors and those who were attacking them and causing them to feel insecure were members of their own family. And instead of staying in this place and the state of insecurity, the Prophet urged his community to leave the city of Mecca on a path towards safety, towards the city of Yathrib, that later became known as Medinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, that became a sanctuary and a shelter for the Muslims. This was a place where the community, the Prophet and his family could live in a sense of peace and security. And it was a place where they were free to live their lives and express themselves without fear. And that is the paradigm or the Islamic ideal, being able to live both free in terms of free of fear and free to think and live as we would desire, of course, in light of the ethics and principles of our faith. And that's where the Quran, in fact, refers to this act of migration that the Prophet embarked upon and the community embarked upon as a source of refuge and abundance. In Surah an-Nisa, Ayah 100, we're told, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ومن يحاجر في سبيل الله يجد في الأرض مراغما كثيرا وسعات. صدق الله علي العظيم. The one who sets out in the path of God will find frequent refuge and abundance. Now, our faith never asks us to keep ourselves in harm's way. When there's an opportunity to extricate ourselves, to move towards the path of safety. And we do a great disservice to our faith and a great harm to the members of our Jamaat when we either intentionally or unintentionally impose our own personal understanding of what is right or wrong or how one should act on others in the name of religion. You see, it's this form of spiritual abuse in the context of family violence that I want to spend a little bit more time on talking today. Now, if we go to the next slide, I'd like to talk about what exactly spiritual abuse is in this context. And this term may be new to many, but its impact and its effect is definitely not new within the world and even within our community. You see, sometimes spiritual abuse can be overt. It can be where a family member, be it a parent, a spouse, even a sibling, they exert this coercive type of control on you, on your movements, on who you associate with, how you dress, how you spend your time, and all of this in the name of religion. Other times it can be even more subtle, like how Farah's husband became violent because she was making him late for Jamaat Khana, as though his right to access his religion and practice in the way that he wishes to allows him to impose violence on others. Now, in addition to causing fear, harm, and isolation, this type of abuse also sadly undermines and attacks the sense of faith and the iman of the person who's on the receiving end of this abuse. Instead of being a source of comfort, of refuge, peace and happiness, as was intended by the Prophet and our Imams, alayhi salam, religion can come to be seen as a source of violence and oppression in these contexts. And this type of abuse is unfortunately all too often exercised against the women in our lives, as though men have the right to assert their whims and desires upon the women in their lives in the name of faith. This is the phenomenon that occurs throughout the world and in nearly every religious community to varying degrees. And our community is unfortunately not immune to this phenomenon. Now, at the broadest level, the societies that we live in, the language that we use in our communities, our community and family dynamics all have a role to play in perpetuating such spiritual abuse. And that's why we need to be very introspective and to look at ourselves and our families closely, to identify and work on changing the attitudes and customs that allow such spiritual abuse to occur. Because Islam, as taught to us by the Prophet and the Imams, is completely against abuse in the faith. If we go to the next slide, we're reminded of the Quranic imperative, La ikra fil din. There is no compulsion in religion. And plainly shaming and coercing people to act in certain ways in the name of religion goes against the central tenet of the faith. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't teach our children about their faith and try to instill in them good values and ethics, or that we can't help cultivate faith and practice in each other. But a line is crossed when we speak in the name of religion to denigrate or humiliate or justify violence against those around us. An example of such justification is how we often either subtly or even explicitly tell the victims of family violence and abuse to stay in such abusive relationships because the faith is somehow against separation or the breaking of familial ties in this circumstance. It's as though one would say that Allah would rather you suffer than seek out a path of safety, which is completely at odds with the faith and the deen that we practice. I'm not saying that every situation of family violence must result in some form of separation, but asking someone to silently suffer and bear through violence in the name of their faith, in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, is a form of spiritual abuse that we as friends and families perpetrate far too often. Go to the next slide. We can see how this is at odds with our deen, especially when we look at the example of our beloved Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the fact that he actualized the Quranic paradigm of women and men being equal spiritual beings in the eyes of God, and that marriage and this type of relationship or partnership should be based on love and mercy. Now, we know that the Prophet would, in fact, listen to the problems and concerns of his community, including the women in his community who experienced domestic violence. The Prophet often publicly rebuked the men in his community who engaged in such violence, and he made it clear that there was no place for domestic violence in his community. Now, I take two things away from this. Firstly, that these women of the Prophet's community did not hesitate to speak out freely on their behalf, to seek redress, and to seek an end to the violence perpetrated against them. The religion was not seen as something that oppressed them. It was in fact an avenue to freedom and safety. Secondly, the Prophet in this way responded to these issues both by addressing it as a communal issue, as an issue that the community as a whole needs to be taken into account and seek a way to address. But in addition to that, he addressed the individuals who came to him for help individually. We know historically that the Prophet didn't hesitate to grant either periods of separation and even divorce when issues of violence and abuse couldn't be resolved otherwise. Our faith was never meant to curtail the freedom and safety of the members of our Jamaat. On the contrary, our Imams have interpreted Islam as a faith of hope and liberation. If we go to the next slide, we can see that in an address to the Pakistan's Women Association in 1954, the third Aga Khan, our beloved Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah alayhi salam, gave an impassioned speech in which he urged, "O my sisters, agitate. Leave no peace to the men till they give you religious freedom. On that foundation of religious equality, you can then build social, economic, patriotic, and political equality with men." This vision of religious freedom, laying the foundation for social, economic, civil, and political equality, is one that stands at complete odds with a vision of faith that keeps us trapped and hopeless. It is this vision of Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah that should give members of our Jamaat strength to lean on their faith and travel on whatever path may be necessary to gain safety and security. With that, I'd like to return the presentation to Zainal and hear more about the journey of Farah.
The rest of the evening was a blur of flashing lights. The neighbors had heard the commotion and called the police. Farah went to the hospital. After she was treated by hospital staff, Farah decided she could not return home. Things had gone too far. The hospital social worker helped her arrange a bed at a safe shelter. Up until that day, she had never considered a shelter as an option. She didn't know where She didn't know there were shelters specifically for women escaping abuse. The shelter counselor was at the door to greet her when she arrived. Her tears flowed, releasing years of tension. The counselor made tea and they sat and talked. Her time at the shelter was memorable. She met other women who had similar experiences, and they would talk late into the night. Sleeping was difficult. There was so much to think about. Her thoughts raced with fears of being on her own. A counselor was always available to lend a listening ear and help her find her way through the myriad of questions and concerns. Where was she going to get money? Where would she live? She had never been to a lawyer. What did she need to do? Would it be easier to just return home? She felt so emotionally fragile and confused, and now wonders where she would be if she had not had the help of the shelter staff and volunteers. I would now like to welcome our special guest, Zainab Ibrahim, to talk about shelter services and supports. Zainab is Iraqi-born and has been living on the unceded land of the Coast Salish peoples for the past 12 years. Zainab is a grad student enrolled in the Masters of Social Work program at the University of Victoria. She currently works as an operation manager at an-Nisa Homes, which is a transitional home for Muslim, immigrant, refugee, and non-status women fleeing violence, abuse, or experiencing homelessness. In recent years, Zainab's work in her community has focused on lowering accessibility barriers for marginalized women and children in need of safe shelters. Welcome, Zainab.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Thank you very much for having me here today. I am truly honored to be here today. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity of raising awareness about the available help and resources for women in need of support and help. And to talk specifically about transitional home and shelters, just because I know there are so many misconceptions and so many myths surrounding transition homes. So I'm hoping that today I'll be able to clarify some of these myths or misconceptions. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So yeah, I do work at an-Nisa Home. an-Nisa Home basically is a group transitional home for women and children, specifically Muslim women and children fleeing domestic violence or homelessness, or at risk of being forced resettlement. We do have, as you can see in the next slide, we do have 8 locations across the country. So one in Calgary, one in Scarborough, one in Edmonton, one in Vancouver, Mississauga, Windsor, Ottawa, and Quebec. The goal of an-Nisa Home is to go beyond providing basic needs such as shelter, food, and clothing. We're hoping that by coming to an-Nisa Home is we provide the opportunity for the women to start their healing journey, to hopefully thrive and flourish as well. So we'll go to the next slide, please. The one after. Yeah, so how can women apply to an-Nisa Home? And just like a disclaimer, as I said at the beginning, I'm specifically talking about an-Nisa Home, but there are so many other transition home and shelters across the country. So I'll touch base on that later on, but for that, I'm specifically, like the example in the process, I'm specifically giving in the context of an-Nisa Home. So women can apply online. It's a very straightforward application. They can just fill out the application online, or they can call and apply. In the case of Farah, Farah could have reached out by herself, or as in the story, she met the social worker at the hospital. So the social worker would give her a list of transition home and help her, calling the one appropriate for her needs. So yeah, we get referrals from religion centers, social services, doctors, settlement agencies, you name it. Next slide, please. So the process, the intake process. So once the women actually call and let us know they need help, we would book an intake, which is like basically virtual meeting, like over the phone, like 20 minutes to 40 minutes, just so to see if, Nisa Home is the right fit for the woman reaching out for help. If it is, then we, arrange transportation, and they will be coming within the same day or the next day. If Nisa Home is not the right fit, then we'll try to connect them with more appropriate services that would fit their needs. Now, as you can see in the next slide, we do have two type of services. So one is the remote service program, which it's a pretty recent program. We just started it when the pandemic hit, so I would say 2020, last year. And the other one is the in-house support program. So for the remote service program, women it's for women who need specific support, such as, a help with legal resources, or applying for subsidized housing, or, they're fleeing, obviously, abuse or risk of becoming homeless, but they need help. They have housing, but they need help to maintain that house. So yeah, we help them with like information and navigation, resources, referrals, assistance with providing application and filling out application, securing housing, employment. So basically, like, they don't necessarily need to come to the transition home. Like, they don't need to come to Nisa Home, because they do have housing, but they have so many other needs that they need to navigate the system. So we help them with that. Now, the other type of service is the in-house support program, which, again, in the case of Farah, they actually come to the transition home, and they would stay up to 3 months. During these 3 months, as you can see in the next slide, they have access to different type of services. Could range from providing financial assistance to mental health support, like having counseling, also like resources, like connect them with resources in the community, and making sure that they get assigned to a caseworker. So their caseworker is the one who would be like in charge and responsible to work with the women reaching out for help, and they would like make sure that they do provide the basic essential needs, such as like food, medicine, clothing, but also make like referrals to government services, employment opportunities, do the house search for them, counseling. So in case of Farah, after she would arrive to the transition home, she would obviously like be provided with a meal, and then next day she would meet her caseworker, and then with the caseworker they will do like a need assessment. So the need assessment is like a 1-hour meeting, or sometimes it goes to 2 hours. Basically, on the need, like during the need assessment, the client will share what are her exact needs, what are her exact goals, what support she needs moving forward, in order to like help her transitioning outside of the transition home, working on safety planning as well, accessing like legal support as well. So again, it really like very client-based service. So it really depends on what the woman need to achieve and what her goals are. And obviously, I keep saying women, but the transition home is very inclusive and welcome of children as well, and youth. And we do have like programs that are specifically for children and youth. So at Nisa Home, we do have like the caseworkers, child care worker who usually work with the children and youth, and we have as well the mental health worker, the counselor, which conduct one-on-one counseling sessions, as well as group sessions. And we have volunteers that they come during the week. They do support the women one-on-one, and the children as well, the youth. They provide like homework clubs, self-care programs for the children and the women and the youth. So there are so many different programs, but again, these are very specific to Nisa homes. Other transition homes, they obviously have also many other programs. Each transition home is very unique in the way they're running, but they all like function in a way that they make sure the woman accessing the service is supported and get access to all the resources or help that she needs at that given time. So as we go to the next slide, so again, like it's very important here, I think, to highlight that this information is very, very important because you don't know who is in your network or cycle actually in need of support and in need of help, and who's actually experiencing domestic violence. It could be your neighbor, it could be like someone within your family that you're unaware of. So it's very important to have this information in case they want to like reach out for support and help. And again, like I know, as I said and mentioned in the beginning, there are many different misconceptions about like transition homes in general. Like I've heard like, oh, they take my children away, or like, it's not safe. And again, this is not very like reflective of the reality. And I think this is one of the reasons that Nisa Home was born, is to also reduce barriers for women who are actually in need of this support and in need of this help, and making sure that our services is very culturally sensitive and culturally competent. But that being said, many other transition homes are also provide excellent services, and it's very, very important to reach out for help if you need that support. Yeah, I think Mumtaz did a great job highlighting why, women end up being in their relationship, why women are not leaving. So I don't want to repeat myself here, but I do want to stress that if you need of support and if you need of help, there is support available. There is help available. It's just like a phone call away, or it's just a phone call away. There's another resource that I would like to share, which you would see on the next slide. So if you Google Ending Violence Association, this website has a listing of victim support services for women and children and youth, as well as a listing of transition homes, listing of crisis lines that you would call in case you need to reach out for support or help. It's an excellent resource. I would suggest taking a screenshot and sharing it with your network, because again, you never know who's actually in need of help and support. So I just want to go back to Farah's story. So in Farah context, after coming to Nisa Home and after she's being assigned to, with a caseworker. The caseworker would work on finding her housing, applying for income assistance, applying for employment, making sure that even after moving out of the transition home, she would actually be connected with other resources, such as counseling. Even after leaving Nisa Home, women can still get support for a few months, but also making sure they're connected with other resources, just to make sure that their transition is smooth and they get all help needed. So now I will hand it back to Zainul to follow with Farah's journey.
Farah remembers the relief she felt when the shelter housing outreach worker helped her find a lovely apartment. This was her very own place. She was safe and free from abuse, but still had a long way to go. She needed employment, legal support, counseling. There was so much to still work on, but she felt safer than she had felt in 25 years. Farah continued to attend counseling at the shelter, and the staff supported her to obtain government financial assistance. One day at a time, one step at a time, she was slowly rebuilding her life. Now that she is safe and can look back, her biggest regret is that her children were exposed to violence. Over the last few months, she has heard from her family and friends that they have always thought or felt like something was not right between her and her husband, but no one ever thought to ask if everything was okay when they were together. Farah admits she worked hard to hide it, but wonders if someone had reached out to her during all those years, if she might have gotten help sooner. You have heard about a few resources here today already. We recognize that talking about family violence is difficult, and some of the information we have shared today may have triggered thoughts and feelings for you. If you would like to discuss more about family violence, or are in a violent or abusive relationship, or know someone in a violent or abusive relationship, you can reach out to the Access line at 1-888-536-3599. I want to reassure you that your privacy will be respected and all calls are confidential. Now let's take a minute to answer a few questions. The first question is, we know Nisa Homes is an Islamic social service organization. What role does the faith play in how you provide your services? Zainab, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Zeno. This is an excellent question, actually. So we do take a holistic and Islamic approach, focusing on, the mental, emotional, and physical, as well as spiritual needs of each woman and child. That's being said, the service delivery is pretty much inspired by Islamic values, teaching, and ethics. So I just want to clarify here that we do serve all Muslim women, regardless of their background, regardless of their sect, regardless if they're practicing or not. And we do understand the spiritual piece that was talked about earlier, and how some might be even disconnected with the faith. So that's why we operate from that lens. And we also, that's being said, we are also inclusive of non-Muslim women, women who are not even Muslim. We emphasize that for Muslim women because we do want to reduce a barrier. Many women don't reach out because they are worried that other transition home are not culturally sensitive or culturally competent. So we do emphasize that piece. However, again, we are inclusive of all women. The priority goes for Muslim women who, again, can come from any background or any sect. So I hope that clarify question.
That does. Thank you very much, Zainab. And it actually leads us into our next question, which is for Al-Waez Jamil. It was interesting to hear about how spiritual abuse is so prevalent and in which way it impacts women. Can you speak more to how that applies to elders, children, and even men in the family?
Sure. So if we go to the core of what spiritual abuse is, it's utilizing faith in a coercive manner, either using a position of power or anything of that sort to denigrate or coercively force someone to do something that they would otherwise not, or in fact, use it to justify violence. And that is, of course, any of those actions tend to really be a disservice to the deen itself, because that, once again, goes against the very grain of what the deen came to establish, this sense of safety, security, liberation, salam, right? One of the root principles of Islam. So in that sense, we can see this particular type of abuse being applied in every context within the familial or even communal structure. So when it comes to children, right, when children are forced coercively, or even sometimes violence is enacted upon them because they don't live up to a certain religious standard, that either a patriarch or a matriarch within the family wishes to impose. That once again crosses a specific line. It doesn't mean that we don't want to impart these values, of course, to our children, certain practices that we find beneficial, that we think will be beneficial in their lives. But we're doing no one any service by imposing this by force or by coercion. In fact, we're pushing people away. In the process, we're creating an immense amount of harm, because you can't take back violence. Violence leaves scars, and those scars take a very, very long time to heal. So when it comes to children especially, the way we instrumentalize religion and our faith, we have to be very, very, very careful. The same thing goes when it comes to even the elders within our community. Sometimes we may put pressure upon our elders with respect to the way in which we want them to support us, because we lean upon these certain feelings of obligation that are both communal, cultural, but somehow tied up into this ball of religious identity as well. And say, well, you're not being, a good Muslim or a good Ismaili if you don't support me in this specific way that I need. And this is a form of coercion that really can be used to take advantage of the elders within our community as well. And when it comes to men as well, spiritual abuse oftentimes in men is a little bit more subtle too, I find. It's when we tell young men growing up that they can't have certain types of pastimes or certain types of expressions of emotion, right? Where we stifle people to the extent that, it's men don't cry, right? This false form of Javan Mardi, right? This idea of chivalry, of being of manliness, when we forget that the exemplars of manliness, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Hazrat Ali alayhi salam, these are exemplars of this chivalry. They themselves did not hesitate to cry and weep, right, in the face of disaster or catastrophe, to share their emotions with their community. We're using, unfortunately, culture tied in with religion to stifle the expressions of the men within our community as well. And there's no wonder then that we are producing sometimes hard individuals in the society in which we live. These men who are supposed to be devoid of emotion, and there is an expression ultimately that sometimes leads to violence as well. That may be somewhat of a root cause, and it's not specific once again to our community, but this is in the zeitgeist, it's in the air of the nation in which we live as well, where we tell our young boys and men that they cannot be fully expressive human beings. And that is a form of spiritual abuse as well.
Thank you for that. And it just highlights the fact that anyone can be a victim of abuse, spiritual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, men, women, elders, children. And it's important to note that as well. So thank you for that. The last question we have is, we have heard about several resources already today. Are there other webinars and sources of information available on the topic? If you would like to learn more about how to build a healthy relationship, you can also access various other webinars delivered over the last year through the Ayah Canada website. These include Love Shouldn't Hurt, Let's Talk About Abuse, Languages of Love, Love During Lockdown, and Connections and Disconnections in Love. Finally, we would like to share that we will be hosting a donation drive for an-Nisa homes. The drive will run from November 15th to the 30th. Please visit the Ismaili Civic page to learn more about how you can participate in this drive. Thank you so much to all our amazing panelists today for being here. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Love shouldn't hurt. There is hope and there is a path to safety.